Day 30 Word of God 2 Corinthians chapter 12 verse 9. And he said unto me, My grace is sufficient for thee. For my strength is made perfect in weakness. Most gladly therefore will I rather glory in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. 2 Corinthians chapter 12 verse 9 is part of a passage where the Apostle Paul speaks about a personal struggle, often referred to as his thorn in the flesh. Paul does not specify what this thorn is, but it represents a source of great difficulty and suffering in his life. He tells the Corinthians that he pleaded with the Lord 3 times to remove this affliction, but God's response was not to take it away but to provide something even greater, his grace. God's answer to Paul emphasizes that his grace is sufficient and that his strength is made perfect in weakness. And he said unto me, My grace is sufficient for thee, refers to God's reassurance to Paul. Grace here means God's unmerited favor, strength, and support. God is telling Paul that his grace is enough to carry him through any trial or weakness he faces. It suggests that God's help and presence are more than sufficient to sustain Paul in his difficulties, even if the thorn remains. For my strength is made perfect in weakness reveals a profound spiritual principle. God's power is most clearly seen and experienced when we acknowledge our own limitations and weaknesses. When Paul is weak, God's strength is demonstrated more fully, showing that it is not human ability but divine power that accomplishes God's purposes. Most gladly therefore will I rather glory in my infirmities, indicates Paul's acceptance and even celebration of his weaknesses. Rather than lamenting his difficulties, Paul chooses to glory in them because they become opportunities for God's power to be manifested. That the power of Christ may rest upon me expresses Paul's desire for Christ's power to be evident in his life. By embracing his weaknesses, Paul makes room for the strength and power of Christ to be more fully displayed in him. The phrase, rest upon me, suggests that Christ's power will cover, protect, and enable Paul through all his challenges. In Exodus chapter 4 verse 10-12, Moses expresses his inadequacy to speak before Pharaoh, but God reassures him, I will be with your mouth and teach you what you shall say. Here, God's power is displayed in Moses' perceived weakness. In Judges chapter 7, Gideon's army is reduced from 32,000 to 300 men so that Israel would know that their victory over the Midianites was due to God's power, not their own strength. This mirrors the principle that God's strength is made perfect in human weakness. The crucifixion of Jesus is the ultimate example of God's power made perfect in apparent weakness. Through what seemed like the ultimate defeat, God accomplished the greatest victory, the redemption of humanity. 1 Corinthians chapter 1 verse 18-25. Throughout his ministry, Paul frequently faced persecution, imprisonment, and hardship, yet he continually relied on God's grace to sustain him. His sufferings became a testimony to the power of Christ at work within him. 2 Corinthians chapter 11 verse 23-30. For believers today, 2 Corinthians chapter 12 verse 9 is a powerful reminder that God's grace is sufficient for every situation we face. It encourages us to recognize our weaknesses not as liabilities but as opportunities for God's strength to be demonstrated in our lives. This verse challenges us to let go of self-reliance and instead depend on God's grace to carry us through our trials and difficulties. It also invites us to find joy and even glory in our weaknesses, knowing that they allow Christ's power to be more fully revealed in us. In a culture that often celebrates strength and self-sufficiency, this verse calls us to embrace a different mindset, one that sees value in humility and dependence on God. Ultimately, it encourages us to trust that God's grace is more than enough for us and that his power is made perfect precisely when we feel weakest. God bless you and give you grace after grace.